Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. A lot seems to be happening around Nigeria's power sector at the moment, with electricity consumers continuing to complain about infrequent and sometimes total blackouts in the face of estimated billing by the State Electricity Corporation and the distribution companies. But Vice President Yemi Osinbajo brought in a different dynamic last week when he claimed that Nigeria now has an installed generation capacity of over 13,000 megawatts. We're now being joined by Dr. Sam Amadi, a former chairman of Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, for a conversation on this subject, in addition to other issues on the front burner in Nigerian political discourse. Welcome to the program. Sam, good morning.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome to the morning show. Good morning. Yes, good to have you again on the morning show. But before we talk about electricity, which is one of the many portfolios you have had to handle in the course of your career, let's talk about some other topical issues. We go from soft to what you may call the hard subjects. What's your take on the assault on Senator Ekweremadu, former Deputy Senate President of Nigeria, in Nuremberg, Germany, where he had gone to attend an event to mark the New Yam Festival. And then his clothes were torn, his cap was removed. In the videos in circulation, we saw him even doing a 100-meter sprint. And then eventually he was rescued and he escaped from the place. And this has been a major subject of discussion about the relationship between the political elite in Nigeria and Nigerians in diaspora. What's your take?
Well, I think most disgraceful and sad, very, very sad. That night, I didn't sleep until 3 o'clock. We were so depressed because for two reasons. One, we do know this divide and this very volcanic disgust and anger of Nigerians, particularly Southeasterners, especially those who live in diaspora. But two quick points to make. One is that it's not a vote of no confidence on Ekweremadu. Ekwuremadu's commitment to the Igbo cause is very, very clear, unimpeachable. Ekwuremadu's even support and help for the IPOB persons when they were in detention and distress is very clear. But what you're witnessing is a serious crisis in the Nigerian politics around what I call the separatists and the federalists. Now, by the federalists, I lump together all kinds of politicians and activists who argue for restructuring, devolution of power, those who believe that the Nigerian political landscape is capable of sustaining a radical restructuring, redrawing, recreation of Nigeria for all those, including myself, who believe in what I call democratic citizenship, the idea that a nation should have one common citizenship of equality. On the other side of the separatists, especially in the Southeast, are those who, a portfolio of guys who talk about either Biafra now or death, those who talk about destroying, dismantling the so-called Caliphate Constitution of 1999, those who talk in terms of massive, maybe co-federation and all kinds of concepts. The idea is that, look, this Nigerian federation cannot work. Now, the Ekweremadu and the Igbo major politicians could not harness it. Those who said, look, the federalists. But the problem is that they are not able to provide results. And so the last National Assembly election, where some of us canvassed strongly for an Igbo speaker in the person of the female legislator, Nkiru, we came back with nothing. And so the overwhelming verdict is that you guys are drawing us back, you guys are saboteurs. So this is not an assault on Ekweremadu as Ekweremadu. Ekweremadu used to be the highest ranking Igbo politician. This is an assault on the perceived failed project of Igbos mainstreaming into the national politics. And these separatists are questioning both the integrity and commitment of the federalists. If you look at the 70 issue, they mentioned Nyanwodo. What has Nyanwodo done? Nyanwodo has not held any position recently. You say he didn't perform. Nyanwodo has been a very strong and credible and respected Igbo voice. The Nyanwodo's sin is that he keeps talking about, let's do election. He keeps saying, let's collaborate with Afenifere, with Pandev, with Middlebelt. and see how we can structure a new Nigeria. They said this can't work. The Igbos are suffering bruised eyes and bruised nose every day. So the argument here should not escape Nigeria. This is not just about Ekweremadu and the Igbo people. This is an argument that is, kind of enveloping South, the whole of the South. An argument is, are we going to allow the separatists to win this debate? Or are we going to allow the federalists, by this government and other governments, investing in trust, social trust, investing in equity and justice, and investing in recreating a Nigeria without the idea of hegemony or any kind of caliphal, rulership over the rest of the country. That's what it is, actually. That's what played out in Nuremberg. And I predict the new patterns will emerge from that, unfortunately, and that will be very devastating.
Dr. Amadi, you just mentioned the words equity and justice, and of course those are words that we'd like to see implemented in actions for the people of Nigeria. And two great issues, separate issues, but they have come together, will be that of El Zakzaki recently and also the detainment of Sowore as well. What is your take on this? Do you think the government is handling issues in the right way? Because seemingly a lot of people home and abroad are aggrieved. Is the government going about citizenship in the right way at the moment and the way in which they're dealing with certain cases? Or do you think citizens also have a full-on right now to be very aggrieved at the actions of this administration? I'd love to get your take.
Well, I believe that our concept of citizenship around government circle has been very poor. First, the government is not doing well with handling those crises, and because it's not doing well because we've not got an enriched concept of citizenship. Now, the state exists for the citizen. You see, we've got what I call a dangerously utilitarian calculus around governance. And that is the idea that somehow we can trample on the rights and dignity of a few persons if, in that utilitarian calculus, we are promoting greater Nigeria. That's really not a democratic thinking. A democratic thinking is a thinking that we have to protect the right of everybody, even if that protection somehow diminishes the collective good. That's what I call the democratic thinking. So bring it back to what's going on with Sowore and others. I have argued that revolution now, that's my view. I have not seen anything, and perhaps the security service have more information. I don't work with them, but nothing in the public domain suggests to me that what was contemplated or what would have happened had any real consequence for national security beyond the type of consequence you will expect in a robust democracy where people have various grievances and they mobilize to articulate them. So what we've done, that we've tried to do democracy like curated. We've seen democracy as a messy thing. You have to deal with the messiness of people having sometimes very distressful, sometimes even stupid, silly views, and you allow them. And containment is a strategy. If policing, for example, if I was advising the government, maybe they will find a way to disperse those gatherings, ensure that it doesn't happen like they did, but at the same time, don't say this is treason. At the same time, don't go and ask for 45 days to perhaps prepare evidence. You just disperse them. If you're going to arrest some people, you arrest them in a way, take them to custody, let them go the next day, because their only agenda is, whether it's misconceived or not misconceived, the idea that through populist action, they can effect a radical change in the system. And your own job, even the known authoritarian Chinese government, has learned a better way of dealing with, so seeming attack on state security or regime security, actually, not state security. So my view is that even the Shiite, I don't think you should describe them as terrorists. Yes, they may have resorted to violence, and that's a conceptual problem. We don't have to distinguish between violent groups and terrorist groups. And so suddenly, Nigeria, a small country, now has relatively small in terms of security issues, now have about 4 or so terror-designated organizations. So we have the classical one, Boko Haram, that the world has acclaimed. We have the Fulani herdsmen that has been internationally recorded. We have IPOB that has been domestically labeled terror. And we have Shiites that are now domestic. So you will now have the prospect that many Nigerians could, in the future, become persons of significance in the terror war against terror. And that's not good for the country. So I don't think Sowore's revolution now was even well articulated. The documentations are contradictory. There's no clarity. Some of the things they're asking for, return fuel to X price, is not something for revolution. I don't subscribe to those items at all. But I subscribe totally to their right to protest. And of course, that what they have done, in my view, until we have evidence to the contrary for the security who may have better information, there's nothing so far in the public domain that suggests that this is treason or this is terrorism. And therefore, we should be a little bit more communicative. We should be more communicative in the sense that government should be in the public space contending against these views. Government can actually demobilize that revolution now through strong argument. In fact, there were very many lack of credibility in that formation that government could have utilized to really get people disown them. But they resort to arrest, they resort to violence, state violence, and the resort to suppression creates a dangerous pathway to even more violent protests. And I think this is what government has to rethink.
Sam Amadi,
yeah.
Very quickly, I would like to ask you a question about the ruling of Mr. Justice Butcher in the case involving the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the PNID. But let's take a short break. When we come back, I will frame that question, and then we can have a conversation around it. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us is Dr. Sam Amadi, former chairman of the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, now a lecturer with Bayes University in the Federal Capital Territory of Nigeria, Abuja. He's been helping us to take a look at a number of topical issues in Nigeria. Now, Dr. Amadi, before we went on break, I said I was going to ask you a question about the judgment delivered by a UK commercial court in a ruling by Mr. Justice Butcher on the matter between PNID, a UK firm, and the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And the matter about, the PNID providing services to Nigeria in the energy sector, and allegations that Nigeria failed to deliver on its own part of the contract. And then, of course, the court has clamped Nigeria now with a judgment order of $9.6 billion. Now, you were in government during the period this was happening. And this was not just about gas, it was also about electricity. PNID was supposed to provide lean gas, from wet gas, and then put that into the national grid. Now, what happened? I'm sure you know about the story. And what do you think are the implications for Nigeria in terms of contractual, obligations, and also the image of the country, and options, remedies, if any, that may be available to Nigeria?
Well, thank you. First, if the president who appointed me, President Jonathan, has said he wasn't aware, then obviously I can't be aware. I was appointed in December 2010, and I started work in NERC. This transaction happened in January 2010 when the former President Yar'Adua was in power. And we should also note, before going to the effects, is that this tells a story as to how we run government. And the argument out there is that this was really something that was contracted by a few so-called cabal. And so if the president who was vice president claimed he never knew anything about this, then that means it tells a story as to how we run government and how we do mega projects. Up to today, we still have those lack of clarity, lack of rigor in project design. Even when I was a special advisor at the National Assembly, I used to see people come to me and say, we have this supply for the defense, and the military did not put in their budget. They want the House to put in their budget. The question is, why should you put something on the budget that the technocrats in government do not consider reasonable? So we are pandering to supply side. So contractors frame projects and dump on government because government lacks the capacity sometimes and don't even utilize the ones they have to frame projects for themselves and look for appropriate suppliers. So this is what's going on here in this country. We allow private sector, so-called, to frame projects that serve their own interests, and they come to government, and government happily buy those projects as if it is part of government planning. No, the best way is that government plans its economic and social projects, and then government select those who have those services that they need and procure them properly with rigor. So we are in a risk of having so many contracts that are not useful, that are loaded against Nigeria, and then there's a result. Now, going back to this issue, you discover that the fact is that they've not even made any investment concretely. They've always claimed to have spent some millions of dollars doing perhaps promotion. No gas was provided, no infrastructure was provided. Nigeria's failure to meet its own obligation now results in almost 20% thereabout of our national budget, and more than perhaps 5% of GDP to be paid as debt. So the question, therefore, is going forward. What we do first? The first impact is that this looks like a dangerous case for us. We have a record of not having very good legal representations based on our own crisis in Nigeria, crisis of nepotism, crisis of corruption on hiring of counsel. We saw that with Bakassi, where some of the major actors came back to say, look, Nigeria didn't go with their first 11 because we needed to perhaps pack it with national character, or somehow we are very reluctant to embrace meritocracy. So we're not even sure the level of legal due diligence, the level of legal expertise we use in the preliminary rounds of the arbitration, of the case we fight in the United States of America, and of course the case we put up in London and we lost. Now the government is going for an appeal and going to utilize other legal remedies to stop that debt from finally crystallizing and stop execution of commercial non-sovereign property or assets. What the first issue that we must have to seriously fight this case. It's not a case to leave for the Ministry of Justice alone. It's a case that there should be a real legal team that have real experience in those areas, including having foreigners lead the team, as the case might be. Okay. The second point, intervention, would be a case now looking at the whole point around what kind of diplomatic issues around preliminary objections as to venue, diplomatic immunity. I think we lost that case in the UK. But at this point, we still have other legal channels to contest this case. But let's have in mind that ultimately, if we lose at the final, we've got to the final bus stop, what happens to this debt? It tells us a story about contracts and political risk. It's not just about the money, it's also about the perception of Nigeria as a country perhaps that's sloppy in contracting, that is quick to dispose of contract. We wouldn't even allow this contract to happen. That's part of the issue. So if we knew that this contract is so bad, is it that the country was so terrible that no reasonable government will allow it to run? Or is it because there's a change of government, the new actors who were not part of that crafting and not a part of the deal decides to caviarly throw away this. So we need to do an audit and find out who are responsible for first contracting a perhaps unimplementable contract, or who are responsible for advising wrongly against throwing away contract. And then that comes back to the power sector. First and foremost, that contract would probably not have helped significantly with the power sector. I don't know. But the critical issue today now is we are faced with discos that are distressed. We are faced with entities that are distressed. People are also arguing for truncating contracts. People are also arguing for reversing deals without paying attention to possible financial and legal outcome of those actions. So I think the takeaway here is we must be careful in contracting. We can't be talking about fighting corruption if we are still allowing private sector dump projects, billions of projects through their cronies and associates in government. And then those projects now become liability to government, and the public value and the interest that the government gets is just minimal. That has been the story of Nigeria. The partnership between those who rule and those who are in the private sector has been deal-making, and oftentimes those deals have not served strategic public good.
Yes, Sam, I get the point that you are making, but just by way of clarification, I don't think that President Jonathan has said anywhere that he's not aware of this particular transaction. What is clear is that this transaction began in 2010, at the time he was vice president, and at the time we had that national crisis over whether he had the authority to act on behalf of late President Musa Yar'Adua or not, President Yar'Adua or not, Umaru Yar'Adua or not. And then, of course, P&ID went to arbitration tribunal.
1 second.
Yes. I'm trying to give you the background.
1 second.
I'm trying to give you the background. Then it was in 2012 that P&ID went to the arbitration tribunal. And then they secured the judgment and all of that. Yes. Now, what are the specific lessons that we can learn from what has transpired? Because if you have read the ruling by Mr. Justice Butcher, you will see that there were condemnation, indictment of the Nigerian government in terms of how we handle the case. The judge was practically saying that Nigeria, just was not serious in pursuing the matter, managing it, seeking, certain reliefs that could have been asked for, and then also failing to even respond to specific issues that were raised, by PNID. But I guess you addressed that when you said this is about failure to run government, manage government properly.
Absolutely. Okay, so the first point I'll make is that my argument that the president claimed not to, the former president claimed not to have known about this, it actually flows from Ureno's statement on his behalf saying it was handled by the cabal when he was frozen out of government. But I take that, okay. The second point you raise is exactly, that judgment says Nigeria did not put up diligent prosecution of his case or defense of the case. And two lessons is we have to be serious. And seriousness in this case is about creating a structure that works. You look at cases that will farm out to clients. What is motivation around those people we give those cases as lawyers to do for us? When I was special advisor to Senate President, I used to see cases that Nigeria had, the National Assembly has no interest. We are just a notified party. And then they will recommend to give to one lawyer for a very humongous cost. And I would say, we have no legal interest to defend. This is a notified party, so that if judgment comes, we implement it. So sometimes the question is, we need to create a government bureaucracy that works. And it's a bureaucracy that's not politicized, that's focused on day-to-day working of government. So for example, if there was a case against government, I tell people that every legal suit is dangerous. That's why even politicians, when they have won clear election in their view, whenever there's a case at tribunal, they spend money hiring senior advocates to keep an eye on that case, because cases mutate. They take a life of their own. It's a small paragraph. I remember when we used to work with Ghanaian Forum, and we used to challenge Chief F.A.R.A. Williams. Whenever he gives his briefs, very short, 4 paragraphs, we are surprised, because that 4 paragraph could be landmine. So I think the first lesson is that we should take everything that borders on challenge to Nigeria in terms of case contracts very seriously, both before we sign up to anything. Today, with Siemens and this electricity project, some people have come from the Association of Power Engineers alleging that none of their guys were part of it, that the guys in the ministry or in the power sector who are engineers are not part of it. I don't know what is true, but the point is we need to, before we sign, we need to do proper due diligence, ramify all the implications of the contract, give it to various experts, and make sure we are good to go. Then when we have cases like we have in this case, first is to assemble the right people with the right kind of skill set. You see, because of Senior Advocate of Nigeria, for example, people lump every skill set around being an SAN. SAN can be a result of frequent case management, but sometimes you need policy skills, sometimes you need actual transnational skills, sometimes you need foreign jurisdiction skills. So we should have government that sits down and map out what do we need to meet this legal challenge. And without any reference to balancing of the team on geography or geopolitics or religion, pick the best things. There are areas at the lower level where you can do balancing. It's very important. But at the high level, we should learn from China. China has meritocracy from middle to top level. Top level should be meritocratic in the sense that people who will go there, because the cost you will incur for failure like we have now is too much. And then finally, the lesson here, therefore, is also that we need to also, not just about the legal skills, we need to also have the wisdom to know when we can cut the losses. Because, for example, the initial cost, if we have done proper legal due diligence, we might discover that perhaps it's in our own interest to admit failure and pay the original cost as in 2012, settle the matter properly, perhaps before we go down this route in 2019, to have almost the judgment debt or the claim now more than double in value. So this is a lesson for a review of governance, process of engagement, around expertise, around management of issues, the kind of urgency. We see in government some letters, some matters, thrown away, nobody knew about it, and then suddenly you under audit, you see things come up. We should have very strong reform around delivery of government job, not just around maybe the bigger political issues around governance of representation, equity, but also the quality of delivery and effectiveness and the speed of response. These are issues that public sector reform, I was a member of the Presidential Committee on Public Sector Reform. We issued a mandatory report, and that's what we focus on. That when we improve the democratic quotient of governance, we should improve its technocratic quotient, the capacity to create results. Otherwise, the lack of result will undermine the democratic quotient. If the country needs so much money, they cannot pay school fees, they can't pay salaries, they can't do fiscal investment, it will come back to undermine democracy. So we should always find a balance. What can we democratize and what do we need excess technical capability to deliver, and we leave it at that. That's how to run a 21st century government.
Well, Dr. Amadi, thank you for that extensive view. We're going to go on another very quick break now, and as soon as we're back, we'll continue with this conversation. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Dr. Sam Amadi, former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, is still here with us on the program. Welcome back to the program, Doctor. I would like to move us on to a topical issue of today, which is the Vice President's announcement of 13,000 megawatts of generated electricity. And the first question I would like to ask you is with regards to us holding on to the transmission part of the entire power sector. We've let go of regulation, we've let go of distribution, but we're still holding on to transmission. Meanwhile, we have very outdated lines, etc. And if we were to privatize the transmission parts of the private sector, what we would also see is that discos will also really owe less. They're likely to owe less to private companies than they are to the government. And the entire structure would just work better. This has been an argument at the forefront for time, but not one that's been taken up by the government. Why is the TCN still managed by the government? I mean, we can also create a body that can regulate the prices between GenCos and discos, but why is the TCN still in the hold of the government?
Well, very good question. Part of the piece of the reform package was that at some point, TCN will be will be privatized. But let's put it this way. I think that we shouldn't be in a hurry to privatize or try to take off TCN from government, because the experiment we had with the discos have not worked. This is the two issues to bear in mind. First, when we were in NERC, we talked about the law talks about making TCN what they call ISO, transmission service provider, independent system operator, and TSP, transmission service provider, two businesses. One is the network, the wire business. So the TCN is like a traffic, a major highway. You have the road that is built by government. All vehicles, commercial vehicles, all apply the road, they pay toll gate. So that is the transmission service provider. He builds the lines, he builds a network. Then we have what we call the system operator, the person who determines who nominates power. When you say nomination, he evacuates you, say, okay, bring your power, don't bring your power, constrains you, ramp down, go up. Like this is like the air traffic control. Now, what the best practice globally is that oftentimes when we unbundled, we unbundle these two sectors so that there's an independent, so that there will be what we call non-discrimination in dispatch. Meaning, if we're going to privatize the generation and there are too many GenCos owned by private persons, I don't want the system operator to say, Sam Amadi company, don't bring your power. No, he was going to dispatch you on merit base. Merit base means if I have no constraint, I dispatch. If I have a constraint, I will not dispatch. Good. So the argument here now is, one, financing. Can we finance the level of investment required in transmission through the way we privatize the discos? One argument is that we may not, because we have seen that the assumption that this money coming from the private sector into this market is a big assumption, because the market is so risky, the financial footprint, the recovery footprint are very poor, and some people will argue that maybe government should continue to invest in common services, meaning the TSP. But that we should have an independent SO, where the discos and the GenCos create a public trust. That's the model we're putting across when we left NERC, a public trust, so that it's a public trust, it's not owned by government, but it's co-owned by all market participants, and you create a governance mechanism for the management. Now, the problem we have in this sector is that we didn't do anything properly. We're supposed to have corporatized and commercialized before privatizing. We didn't do that. Up to today, TCN has no board. TCN is run without a board. So you don't even have a fully corporatized entity. A corporatized entity is the one that has a board that gives policy direction to the management, not the one that the ministry or the villa gives policy direction. That's why it is a regulated entity. When we were in power, when we wanted to appoint a TCN board under Jonathan, I objected that they didn't follow the processes that we have in our guideline. And Jonathan had to reverse it. They need to have an independent director, and they did that. So I think the problem with the TCN is that, and the sector, is that we should get back to re-regulation. The TCN runs the market rules, which is signed by the president for the whole market. The market rules is a rule-based governance process that indicates who does what. With that rule-based governance process, it doesn't matter if it is owned in the interim by government, meaning government finance the other aspect of TSP. But the SO, the independent system operator, lives on the market charges, just like NERC. The money we pay for our bills, some part of it goes to cover their cost for running an efficient electricity market. So I think that the answer to all this is to get back to re-regulation, an independent regulator who takes a full arm embrace of other sector. What we are having today is that we have not yet had a truly reformed electricity market, fully commercialized and corporatized. If you do that, then the next step will be perhaps you sell to investors as and when necessary, not to sell the way we do with the discos, sell some to very unknown and incapable investors who don't have the financing on the assumption that the tariff will fit the money for investment. It wouldn't happen that way.
Well,
if you want to privatize,
Sam Amadi, incidentally, the federal government at this point is not complaining about transmission. It's not complaining about regulation. Rather, the federal government of Nigeria is complaining through the Ministry of Power, through the MBET, and most recently through the Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, who has been reported in the media, about the discos, the distribution companies. And one story that is out there is that the federal government is considering canceling the contracts of the discos, the distribution companies, pay them off to the tune of about 736 billion naira, and then perhaps repossess those assets or perhaps reassign them to other investors, because the perennial complaints about the inability of the discos, as they allege, to meet the terms of contract, and all the issues about metering, about complaints from electricity consumers, and the debt that is owed the bulk trader up to about 800 billion by the distribution companies. Will you consider, the payment of 736 billion to the distribution companies and the cancellation of the agreements reached under the National Electricity Reform Act a good move by the federal government?
Well, first, I think I agree with the federal government that the disco is a bottleneck now because the TCN is, in my view, doing fairly better than other part of this market. They are at least building their capacity and they are being more proactive. But the disco's crisis is first a crisis of financing and a crisis of change management. Now, what's the solution? I don't agree that it's wise for us to pay off the disco, the investors, and then give back again to another set of investors who will have fancy graphs and fancy proposals, but basically lack the capacity to make any difference. Let me tell you the truth. The truth is that we ought not have privatized when we did. And I've said that before. We ought to have corporatized fully, and then like Egypt is doing. Egypt has given itself up to 2023 to bring cost-effective tariff, to remove subsidies, and subsequently, when they already have capacity, plus a new 10,000 megawatts, they cannot look for real investors because no investor will come to a market, real investor this time, to a market that's so full of risk, where you don't even have the commodity to sell. We are dealing with less than 3,500 megawatts on a daily supply. Forget the nameplate capacity, what we can generate, either because of constraint, gas, transmission bottlenecks, or disco, more especially disco bottleneck, is less than 4,000 megawatts on the average. So which investor will come to that market? Even that 4,000 megawatts, you are not returning revenue for less than 50% of that 4,000. So there's a huge and growing debt deficit. So which real investor will come to that market? So government has to do the heavy lifting. So the things I recommend is two. One, government has a 40% notional ownership share in all the discos. government can commercialize that shareholding, go to institutional investors, not private investors. What that means is that you can go to UBA, it's an institutional investor. The MD of UBA is not an institutional investor. You can go to power company in Europe, it's an institutional investor. Now, why do you want institutional investors? They're investors who have institutional capability, who have a name to protect a reputation. And what they would try to do is to make sure that that 40% holding manifests in policy making for the electricity market. They will either buy back some part of the failed investors and therefore reclaim ownership of the network and reinvest and grow the company. So government should look for institutional investors to take their 40% as a start so that those can use corporate strategies to find a way to buy out the majority shareholding from these investors who, in my view, their failure is not the main bad for the sector, is that they have no way to raise the kind of funding they need in the short term to really address their bottlenecks and receive more power from the grid and sell and return revenue to the market. The second purpose I think that matters here is the regulator is at the heart of it. And I've argued that the regulator should set a new benchmark for 6 months and say, look, if you do not measure up, industry peer-reviewed benchmark, after 6 months, we will take regulatory action, not policy, not political action, to redesign your franchise.
Sam Amadi. Sam Amadi.
Yeah.
When you talk about institutional investors, the way you have described it, it's still another way of saying, there should be, more private sector involvement. So I see a contradiction in what you are proposing.
Yes, the 40%.
Yeah,
no,
the 40%.
No, I'm saying that the private sector, since you have already sold to private sector, don't go and spend public money again, taking back and looking for another weak public sector. Give that your 40% to another institutional investor to counteract the inefficiency of the existing 60. And true normal, and by the way, that's what we should have done. We should have sold the discourse as a bazaar. We should have corporatized them and allowed them, through strategic engagement, to divest themselves to private sector gradually, based on case by case. There are some institutional investors who will come with a good idea and they take 40, and they bid 40 to 50, 60, 70. Gradually, you have a little sector that is 100% privately owned, but more efficient because it didn't sell. Every auction all over the world for privatization, you sell below value. You likely sell to people who don't have the skills because you are selling ailing and dying institutions. Everybody knows that if you privatize it, it means that first that institution is not working. If it's working, it won't be privatized. Therefore, they discount the value. So my argument is, first start with the regulation, set a new benchmark.
Sam Amadi,
then you can take back some of the network. Yeah.
Sam Amadi, would like to thank you very much for coming to the morning show. We'll have to close the conversation here. Thank you very much for coming.